Good morning, everyone. I'm Urmila, and first of all, I'm really sorry for not physically being there for the panel discussion, and I'm really grateful to Professor Rajvanshi and Professor Mathur for accommodating my participation using this technology. Thank you very much, and kindly bear with me. I'm using my phone to do this recording, and I'm actually not showing myself directly, as in you can see my reflection. So, hello everyone. It's because that every time I flip the camera screen, it's turning the screen upside down. So with that, let me come straight to the point. I have been asked to share my experience and reflect on them. My experience on environmental impact assessment follow up within the mining sector in India. And in doing so, I have structured my talk into these four parts. First of all, I'm going to share with you my background and the kind of activities I have been involved with very briefly, just to help you give the context of the experiences on the basis of which I'm sharing my reflections today. Secondly, I am trying to establish the theoretical understanding, or if you like, the international understanding of what we mean by EIA follow up. This is important because when we do share our experiences today on EI follow up in India, the international understanding will help us to compare and contrast this Indian experience against the worldwide understanding as well. And I'm also conscious that I'm surrounded by quite a few practitioners here. But I do believe that theory and practice should mutually enrich each other to deliver us better outcomes. So, this is a great opportunity to bring these two things together. In part three, I'm going to reflect on some of the key kind of messages that I feel I have received from my experiences of EI follow up in the mining sector. And finally, I'm conscious there is a limited time, but I would like to show some pointers as possible way forward. And I'm sure in this panel discussion, with all the experiences that we have here, we will be able to eventually at some point elaborate this. I have a PhD on environmental impact assessment follow up, specifically for the open cast coal mines in India. And therefore, the experiences that I share, a lot of it is shaded by specifically by open cast coal mines. I have been also associated with various research projects with EIA in India, and I have around 17 years of experience of researching on this subject. Along with this, I have been supervising students who work on EIA follow up as well, and have specifically looked into international understanding experiences, and specifically for Nigeria, Iran, and Bangladesh. Though I have to say, the Bangladesh project has just only started, so I have looked at EIA follow up more closely in Nigeria and Iran. And currently, one of my projects, what I'm engaged with, is actually evaluating how EIA has evolved over the last 30 years, because 2018 marked the 30-year of the understanding of EIA as we see it in India, and therefore I wanted, this is something that I'm currently doing, and this also involves doing a systematic literature review. So a lot of things that I'm saying is based on um, the literature that I have been reading, which has been collected for the past 30 years. In doing these various things, I have visited various mining sites, mainly open cast coal mining sites in India. I have held many interviews, more than 80, with people working in the Ministry of Environment and Forest and Climate Change, with developers themselves, with the Central Pollution Control Board, as well as various state pollution control board members, with the regional offices of the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change. I've also had the privilege of meeting three past coal ministers of India, and I've met various NGOs and also people who have been directly affected by coal mining activities. I have conducted surveys with EI practitioners in India, and I have conducted case studies of open cast coal mines in different states in India. And finally, of course, as I mentioned in my previous slides, I have been reading systematically all literature that has been published in on this subject for the past 30 years. So first of all, what do we mean by EI follow-up? It's actually a generic term, and there are various kind of activities, if you like, that are encompassed within the generic term of EI follow-up. And these activities include monitoring, auditing, ex post evaluation, post decision analysis, post decision management, and so on. So, of course, there is a lot of emphasis in this, the first definition that I've shared on post decision. And of course, rightly so, because follow up is once the EIA has been done, we are following it up. So, essentially, it is based in post decision analysis. However, based on the first definition, I've then developed my own definition way back in 2006. And what I have tried to emphasize here is that although it is a post decision activity, its foundations are actually laid with the pre decision EI. And this is a very important point because just focusing on monitoring and after the EIA is a lost opportunity because how we do it, who is responsible, what's the design of it, all of these are actually decided, if you like, in the EIEMP, as we call in India. And therefore, its foundations are laid within the pre decision stage. And it involves a range of activities, and these include monitoring, evaluation, communication, and management. Again, out of these four, the common understanding pays a lot of attention to monitoring, and sometimes communication and management are not that well recorded, specifically in the Indian context. Finally, all of this is done involving effort of various stakeholders, and these stakeholders of course will depend on the project that we are looking at, and by using these different processes involving people, the idea is that we are translating EIA into reality. But we need to understand that environmental impact assessment is a process that is full of uncertainty. And therefore, when we translate it into reality, it is but obvious that there will be differences between what the prediction was and what is happening on the ground, because there's always something or the other that are changing. There are too many kind of variables in this equation. Therefore, essential aspect of follow-up should be adaptation and ongoing project development. It's not a static thing, it's something that needs to continue with the project. In summary, there are four aspects: it's monitoring, and then it's auditing, it's also evaluating and judging whether what kind of adjustments may be needed. And finally, when all of this is done, it's extremely important that the different stakeholders who are involved in this process also are communicated with, and that there is dissemination of the understanding and evaluation of follow up with all stakeholders. This particular diagram lays in front of you the principles of best practices of follow up. And according to this principle, which was actually established by Morrison, Saunders, and Arts way back in 2004, we see that there are three kinds of questions that are being asked. First is, what are the contextual factors that affect EI follow up? Second, how is it actually conducted? Third, who are the people who are involved in EI follow up? And this what, who, and how together decides on the EI follow up outcomes. So I actually used these principles and I was testing them on the EI follow up of open cast coal mining sector in India. And one thing that came out pretty strongly is that when I was speaking to people, whether it was the ministry, the proponents, or even academics in this field, quite a few of them said that This is, some things are done quite well in a particular state or in a particular company, or in a particular region. And there were, if you like, assumptions of some areas doing better than others. What was coming out pretty strongly is that there are trends, and there are assumptions of how things are conducted or how efficiently EIA follow up is conducted based on where this is being done. And therefore, I sort of influence the international best practice by asking another question. Apart from who, what, and how, I questioned where. Where is this EI follow up taken place? And once I implemented this particular principle or framework on actual case studies, it was evident that how EI follow up is conducted and the final outcomes are to a great extent influenced by the other specific kind of contextual factors which were not considered earlier. These are based on the question of where, and these can be economic factors, social factors, political factors, and environmental factors. Of course, to a great extent, the establishment of our state level environmental impact assessment authorities really equip the Indian system to take into account the contextual factors on the different in the different states. However, there for the bigger open cast coal mines or for bigger mining projects, generally speaking, there is of course a standardized approach. And I think what I'm trying to bring here is just a bit of sensitivity to how these kind of factors influence follow up outcomes so that we can make adjustments in the different regions or in the different states, or be a bit more sensitive of how follow up design can take these differences into account. So, hopefully, we now understand what follow up is and what are the different things that are influencing it. I'm now going to very quickly go through some of my reflections on what I found from my experiences. Now, when I started off in looking at the best practice, my assumption was that the states that are economically better off will have more resources and capacity, and hence follow up will be more efficient. However, when I actually visited the regional offices and the State Pollution Control Board, as well as the proponent sites of the open cast coal minings, my findings were rather different. What I realized was that the economically well off states had many more economic activities taking place. And as a result, the kind of pressure that was there on compliance checking, especially on the regulators, was extremely high. In fact, it was not really possible or feasible for compliance to be checked of these units on a yearly basis because it's just beyond the capacity. And therefore, in the Indian scenario, economically well off states have more pressure and have more challenges in terms of compliance checking of EI follow up activities. The second thing that was very interesting is in some units which were not necessarily in the most economically well off states but were actually quite profit making themselves, the follow up activities were done pretty thoroughly and efficiently, and clearly there were international collaborations that were established in delivering what was being achieved. One of the examples was that specifically in open cast coal mines, as we know that the overburden maintenance is quite critical. And in some of these case studies, there was very high technology involved of toe wall building, which was very, very impressive. And this is, of course, something that didn't surprise me, that the unit itself is economically quite well off and therefore can afford to do very useful and high kind of technology based EI follow up activities. But again, continuing with economic factors, what was also interesting to see is that there was a case study which was not in an economically well off state, which was not in a company that was making a lot of profits. However, they had some very, very innovative techniques of how they were monitoring any movement in the overburdened dumps. And this was shared to me by the management there, that what they simply do is they stick they stick papers on special kind of papers on these overburdened dumps, and on a day-to-day basis, if the papers are wrinkling, it then suggests to them of how there can be movement in these overburdened dumps. Now, what I'm trying to bring out is that, this is a kind of approach and technique. Mining is a very technical activity, and there is a lot of expensive kind of follow-up activities that are conducted as a result of it. But there are also some very innovative, simple techniques which can encourage day-to-day monitoring. And there were these pockets of innovation which I could see, which were not expensive. However, they were being they were simple and effective. And I'm not saying that they replace the technologically sound monitoring practices, but what I'm trying to say is that these practices, these innovative ones, were not really being recorded or not really being communicated with anyone. And I thought that these are little gems that should be communicated as well. In terms of environmental factor, and I'm going to talk about the overburden dumps as well, because I'm using it as a common theme across the different experiences I've had. So I went to this one particular site, and as you are noticing, I'm not mentioning the state and the company to maintain confidentiality. But here, this particular mining activity was is slightly located in a hilly terrain. And the first thing that I observed is that the overburden dumps were actually much more steeper than what I had been observing in other projects. And the conditional letters, of course, from the ministry state it's about 28 degree at which the overburden dumps need to be maintained. Here they were much steep, and of course, I asked the question that this definitely doesn't look like it's maintaining the required angle. And I was told by the proponent that they were aware of it, but the problem was that because it was a hilly terrain and there was no flat space, the 28-degree requirement would make the overburden dumps take much bigger space, which was not really there. And I later also realized that the regulating agencies were conscious that this was not being achieved in this particular case, and that there was an understanding between the compliance officers and between the company that, okay, 28 degrees is not being possible to maintain. लेकिन ये ठीक है, ये it's fine. There was an informal understanding. And when I inquired that why is this informal understanding not being translated, or not, it's not really being accommodated or changed in the conditional letter, I was told that this is a very complex procedure. It would take years. It's better to just continue with this informal understanding with the compliance officers. And this made me think that the procedures are so difficult within the Indian system that if you wanted to make changes, or if you wanted to tailor it to specific needs, it's not really flexible enough. And this came out very strongly in the Indian system, that compared to international requirements, the Indian requirements are actually quite strong. However, their implementation is weak. And maybe because the whole system is rather in a policing, has a more of a policing kind of feel, and procedurally quite complicated. And it doesn't allow for this flexibility to be accommodated. In terms of social and political factors, um, areas or states which have a tradition of higher education or awareness amongst its people. Sometimes it's not a state. State is quite big. Sometimes they were these just projects situated in certain areas with much well-to-do population who have better understanding. And of course, then in mining activities, you have some very virgin areas that are also touched upon. But the kind of awareness that was there by the stakeholders, especially the public, definitely influenced the participation and how meaningful it was. There were areas that were pretty remote. People who were participating were very quite clueless. And this was again being influenced by politically sensitive areas who were manipulating these people who really didn't understand the technicality or the importance of environment, and they were manipulating, of course, the economic needs of the people. So definitely, if you are aware that it's a sensitive area, and the way public participation is conducted and way it influences the follow-up activities that need to be recorded are quite different. uh, and this was quite evident in one of a case study where there was very less population, and the follow-up was very, very effective because there was less, if you like, interruption of socio-economic factors in the follow-up. I'm not saying that they are not important, but in a region, in an area where these are less, the proponent could clearly do much more for the kind of projects that they were involved in, for the environmental kind of follow-up activities. So these are very general kind of findings that I felt. Some other general issues included that EI and EMP is not really being treated as an ongoing dynamic document. The moment the clearance is granted, EMP is stacked on the shelves and nothing much happens. The conditional letters themselves act like the benchmark, and sometimes these conditional letters are pretty repetitive, and it doesn't allow for this cyclical process of EIA to be happening. So there are these best practices, there are these individual problems that are associated with certain projects, but these are not really fed back into the system, which makes it very difficult perhaps for even the appraisal committee to take into consideration these specific requirements that perhaps could influence the conditional letters in eventually. There was very little cumulative impacts that were considered, and follow-up in India is very, very compliance based. It's about the conditional letters, whether it's being achieved or not. But follow-up internationally could be more performance oriented, could be more dissemination oriented, and I think that in India, so far it is a very, very rigid process, which makes it very inflexible, and even compliance itself is not really fully achieved because of this rigidity. Some of the pointers in terms of way forward: if EIA document is being done with so much of investment, I think we should make more use of it. There can be certain sections specified in the document that can also be legally requirement or can be used in the conditional letters, making the conditional letters more useful or more catered to specific regional idiosyncrasies of the projects that are concerned. There is some interesting way in which this whole mechanism can be done, and the Environment Agency in England and the Netherlands Commission of Environmental Assessment are some bodies that I think we should look into in terms of how they help the proponents to abide or to become better regulated, or helps them to inspire to be more environmentally motivated. And I think there can be some lessons learned for that. And finally, the because of cumulative impacts not being considered, because of some projects just falling under the net of EIA, there is the importance of a more strategic level and regional level of environmental assessment. And if follow-up takes into consideration a regional style of things, then a lot of gaps that we see in the project level can be overcome. So this is what I had to say. Thank you very much again for involving me. And I'll be looking forward to what the panel is discussing. So I'll be looking forward for the feedback. Thank you very much.